This is one of a series of Good Answers presentations, offering evidence to answer skeptical challenges to the Bible's accuracy. We look today at the first book in our Bible, Genesis. Here we find the account of creation, of our parents' sin in the garden, of the deepening wickedness of their descendants that led to the judgment of the flood, of the Tower of Babel and the confusion of tongues that scattered the human race over the globe. And then we read how God chose a single man and his family to become his special people. Here is the account of Abram, who became Abraham, father of many nations, with Isaac, Jacob, and his sons. Fascinating stories filled with moral and spiritual truth. But what about the patriarchs? Are they real historical characters who lived, worked, and died at a time and place in history, or something else? There are spokesmen who will tell us that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the others are not historical. They're ghosts. One famous scholar, creator of the so-called documentary hypothesis, was Julius Wellhausen. His theory that the first 5 books of the Bible were composed by several unknown writers and editors over several generations is still taught in many universities today. Here was his view of the patriarchs. The Bible provides no historical knowledge of the patriarchs, but only of the time when the stories about them arose in the Israelite people, from Prolegomena to the history of Israel. In this view, Genesis will only tell us about the writers of documents he called J, E, and P, men he claimed wrote more than 1,000 years after the days of Abraham and the others. We might want to know a bit more about Wellhausen, given his enormous influence on biblical scholarship. After teaching theology for years at the University of Greifswald, he chose to resign his post. Here's an excerpt from his letter of resignation. I became a theologian because the scientific treatment of the Bible interested me. Only gradually did I come to understand that a professor of theology also has the practical task of preparing the students for service in the Protestant Church, and that I am not adequate to this practical task, but that instead, despite all caution on my own part, I make my hearers unfit for their office. Since then, my theological professorship has been weighing heavily on my conscience." End quote. His honesty, admirable to be sure, compelled him to resign when his unbelief began to poison the faith of his students. That was long ago, we might say, away off in Europe. But Wellhausen's influence has lain heavily on biblical scholarship ever since. Here's a more recent scholar who shows the force of that influence. Not only has archaeology not proven a single event of the patriarchal traditions to be historical, it has not shown any of the traditions to be likely. End quote. Let's see one more quotation, one with some specifics. Is there any historical kernel embedded in the narrative? Obviously, it contains much legendary matter. The stories of Lot, Hagar, and Keturah are ethnological myths. Ethnological myths are tales developed to explain the origins of various ethnic groups. The author is referring to Lot as the ancestor of the Moabites and Ammonites via his daughters, and Hagar, Sarah's servant, as ancestor of the Arabs, and Keturah, Abraham's second wife, from whom the Midianites descended. All these, he says, are myth, not history. Continuing, the theophanies, like the three angels who visited Abraham and Sarah on their way to Sodom, and the story of the destruction of the cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, are legends, and the story of the attempted sacrifice of Isaac is a product of the regal period, the 800s B.C., 1,000 years after Isaac. Abraham's kinsfolk, Genesis 22:20-24, are personifications of tribes, like Kemuel, cited in Genesis as ancestor of the Arameans, and his predecessors and successors from Noah to Jacob are mythical or legendary. Now this is a profoundly negative judgment against the Genesis narrative. Where does it come from? Believe it or not, it comes from here, the JewishEncyclopedia.com, in its article Abraham, written by 4 Jewish scholars who are systematically rejecting their own heritage. They leave no doubt about their view of the patriarchs, just ghosts. Maybe a look at 2 scholarly viewpoints about the historical books of the Old Testament will help here. The traditional view, held by biblical scholars for centuries, goes like this. The Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, was written by him around 1400 B.C. Joshua, written a bit later. Judges and Ruth were penned in the time of the Judges, or soon thereafter. 1st and 2nd Samuel come from during or soon after Saul and David. 1st and 2nd Kings from the time of the divided kingdom after Solomon. 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther are products of the time just following the Jews' return from Babylonian captivity. Overall, then, this view holds that most of the historical books were composed around or soon after the events they describe. But another view appeared in the past generation or so. In that view, all of the historical books of the Old Testament were composed in the so-called Persian period, in the 500s B.C., after the return from Babylon. All of those books would then have been written long after the events they record. These so-called minimalist scholars would say that some Judahite priest or priests in the Persian period set about to create a noble history for this people, but with little knowledge to go on. So what is the effect of taking that view? Saul, David, and Solomon become petty chieftains and unimportant. The events of the time of the Judges, the conquest of Canaan and the Exodus, are seen as unlikely, and the patriarchs just plain unreal. In other words, ghosts. Well, are the minimalists right when they deny that Genesis gives us any reliable information from the time of the patriarchs? Let's see. Consider times and places for starters. Genesis 2 tells us, when they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem. Most any Bible dictionary, or even Answers.com, will help us there. Shechem, town, central ancient Palestine, the modern Tel Balatan, between Mounts Gerizim and Ebal, near Nablus. Excavations in the 20th century indicate a village there around 3500 BC. Now picture yourself as a Judahite priest in the 6th century, writing this passage. How much would you know about the towns of Canaan over 1,000 years earlier? Many of the towns he knew were not nearly that old, and if he had named one of them, he'd have a major blooper on his hands. But he refers to Shechem, a truly ancient city. One wonders how he knew. Moving on, though, we see that from there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord. Genesis 12:8. Between Bethel and Ai. The name Ai actually means the ruin. Archaeology tells us that there was a major city there in the early Bronze Age before Abraham's time. We don't know what it was called because it was destroyed. And when Abram passed there, it was lying in ruins. Centuries after Abram, it was rebuilt as a small village. But how did a writer some 1,200 years after Abram know that, in the Patriarchs' time, it was a ruin? Notice another episode, one involving Lot, Abram's nephew. He had taken up residence in Sodom when a coalition of 4 kings swept down from the northeast to attack Sodom and the other cities of the plain. They took booty and captives, and it was only through Abram's swift action that they were rescued. But there's something about that alliance of 4 petty kings that should catch our attention. Kenneth Kitchen, a respected authority on the ancient Near East, tells us why. Quote, "Thus, from circa 2000 to 1750, or 1650 at the extreme, we have the one and only period during which extensive power alliances were common in Mesopotamia and with its neighbors. Alliances of 4 or 5 kings were commonplace and modest then." End quote. Did you catch that? Before Abram's time, the Near East was dominated by large empires like Sumer and the old Babylonian Empire. And after Abram, we would see more major empires like Assyria, Babylon, and Persia. But in Abram's time, Kitchen tells us, and only then, there were alliances like these. How would a Hebrew priest, writing in a province of the vast Persian Empire, know about that? And then there is the business of treaties and covenants in the patriarchal period. We know a fair amount about the form and provisions of treaties from that time, since sites like Mari and Tel Leilan have turned up many examples for us to study. They regularly had 4 elements. Witnesses had to be specified for the agreement, which would also include stipulations, that is, the particular things agreed to. Then, oaths would be sworn on both sides, and the agreement would usually be sealed with a ceremony of some kind. Now notice what we read in Genesis 21. When Abraham reproved Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized, the 2 men made a covenant. Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock apart. He said, "These 7 ewe lambs you will take from my hand, that this may be a witness for me that I dug this well." There both of them swore an oath. So they made a covenant at Beersheba. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree at Beersheba, and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. All the terms are there. 7 lambs as witness, and a stipulation. It was Abraham who had dug the well. Then they each swear an oath, and Abraham ceremonially plants a tamarisk tree. There are examples of the same pattern with Isaac at Gerar and Jacob with Laban. The significant fact here is that the standard forms for treaties change over time. And here, Professor Kitchen helps us again. When tabulated, the content of these 4 treaties, he has cited a 4th, does correspond quite closely to what we find in both the process of enactment and the final documents at Mari and Tel Leilan, and not to what was current at other periods. Notice that before and after the time of the Patriarchs, treaties used different forms. But in this period, they followed the pattern we see in the Genesis passages. It's fair to ask, I think, how would a writer in the Persian period, more than 1,000 years later, know what form of treaty to include in his work? Remember when Abram and Sarai went down into Egypt, and Abram, fearing his wife's beauty would make for trouble, lied and said she was his sister? Pharaoh himself took her for his harem, and only a plague from God revealed the truth. Then, as Scripture says, so Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife, take her and go." Biblical commentators have sometimes questioned this story, since it narrates a conversation between Abram and Pharaoh. There appears to be no interpreter in the tale, so how could they understand one another? Certainly a priest composing the story long afterward couldn't have had discourse with any Egyptian. The priest would only know Hebrew, and not Egyptian. Not so Abram, as Dr. Stephen Collins points out. While Abram certainly adopted Canaanite, which later became Hebrew, as his new language when he entered Canaan, Akkadian, his birth language, continued to be a great asset to him. Thus, when he stood face to face with Pharaoh in Egypt, they could easily converse in Akkadian. After all, Egyptian kings were highly educated, and without doubt would have spoken the language of international diplomacy. Just as in the 18th or 19th century, every diplomat would have to know French, every ruler or diplomat in Abram's day would know Akkadian. And so did Abram. Problem solved. Of course, the two of them could converse. But if Genesis was composed more than 1,000 years after the events, how would its author know that? The examples continue, as this quote from Dr. Collins shows. Even the names of the ancient Hebrew patriarchs reflect the popularity of what's called the Amorite imperfective. Names beginning with Yah, 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 such as Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, as it occurred in the Middle Bronze Age. Such names decreased in frequency through the Late Bronze Age and became rare in the Iron Age. The biblical text follows this same pattern. If we recall how names go into and out of fashion, this fact will reveal its importance. In the 19th century, many boys were named William and many girls Mary. Now, a newborn boy is much more likely to be a Noah or Mason, and a girl Emma or Olivia. Names went in and out of fashion in ancient Hebrew society too, and the names of the patriarchs fit what we know was popular then, but not before and not after. How would a much later author know to use those names? And finally, recall when Joseph's brothers so hated him that they sold him to Ishmaelite traders to be a slave in Egypt? The Genesis account says they got 20 shekels of silver for him. As with ancient treaties, so with ancient slavery. We have numerous records from various periods of slaves bought and sold in the ancient Near East. Joseph, we saw, was sold for 20 shekels of silver. What was the average price of a slave in the 1800s BC? That's right, 20 shekels of silver. But jump down to the 1400s BC with Moses and the law. Exodus 21 tells us, "If the ox gores a slave, male or female, the owner shall give to their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned." And what was the average slave price in that period? 30 shekels of silver. Evidence of some inflation over 400 years. Now let's look at that supposed author of this story, writing late in the Iron Age, the 500s BC. If you want a slave then, it will cost you 90 to 100 shekels. More inflation. Prices change over time, as we all know well, and we can consult charts or textbooks to find the records of those changes. But there were no such books available for our Hebrew scribe in the Persian period. How could he possibly have known enough economic history to get Joseph's price right? Let's return then to that article in the Jewish Encyclopedia. Is there any historical kernel embedded in the narrative? Obviously it contains much legendary matter. Abraham's kinsfolk and his predecessors and successors from Noah to Jacob are mythical or legendary. If we believe this, then the patriarchs are, as I have suggested, only ghosts. But then we would have to explain how those tales about the patriarchs contain accurate places and times, accurate military practices, like the coalition of kings that raided Sodom, accurate covenant forms, time-appropriate names for the patriarchs themselves, like Isaac or Ishmael, and accurate slave prices. Skeptics are fond of asserting that we know nothing about the patriarchs because we haven't found ancient documents outside the Bible that mention them. But that's a phony argument. The overwhelming majority of people who lived and died in the past went unmentioned by the historians. For the most part, only kings, conquerors, and the occasional philosopher warranted a mention. We have no right to expect that Isaac or Jacob would be cited in the records of the Hittites or Egyptians. But there is other evidence. The places they visited, the things they did, and even the names they bore are just what we would expect from that period. Now, legends are characterized by distortion, exaggeration, and runaway imagination. Genesis has none of that. Instead, it describes a world that is just like the one archaeology reveals to us. It has the ring of truth. No, the patriarchs are not ghosts. They're people. And what we read of them is not legend. It's history. If you have questions about this lecture, or any of the others in the Good Answers series, you may direct them to me, Dr. Jerry C. 4 at yahoo.com.